Tomáš Zídek podcast. Dobrý den. Guten Tag. Ni hao.
And welcome to the new episode of my podcast. And today I have two special guests, Elfie and Dominik. Welcome here.
Hi, Tomáš. Thank you for having us.
Hello.
And I have to say that I am a bit nervous today because I'm so excited to have Elfie and Dominik here. And that's for the reason that they have a special value to me because Elfie and Dominik, they did a really amazing thing. They have traveled around the world, mainly I think was North America, as I understood. And they were living in a caravan and they were discussing solution focus with many people who somehow worked in the solution focused field. And they were traveling with their daughter, Bibi, and they recorded an amazing podcast, which is called Simply Focus. And it was a couple of years ago when I started being interested in solution focused. I was doing my training, my education to become solution focused coach. And I was listening to this podcast every day. So they are very special guests for me subjectively, but they are also very special guests objectively because they have done really a lot of interesting things. And I was thinking how to introduce them, but I couldn't make up my mind because there is so many things. And as Elfie and Dominik, they are real professionals. So I was thinking, well, maybe I can leave it up to them.
Well, that was a perfect introduction already. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Tomáš. That means a lot. And I think you mentioned already a few things that are a very important part of our work, but we don't really distinguish so much between work and life because we think work is life as well. And we try to, I think, really bring the sparkles of joy and ease into whatever we are doing. So that's under the bottom line. Maybe that describes us best. That we look for the essence. We enjoy to have meaningful conversations, and found that the solution-focused approach is really the thing for us to have that, to do that, and to embrace the solution-focused assumptions and ideas in our everyday life and work, if you want to distinguish.
And we work a lot with leaders. And what we realized there is that the leadership is a lot about everyday interactions. So our fascination for everyday interactions, and especially solution-focused everyday interactions in leadership, but also in life, really fits well together.
Yeah. And so for the listeners, just to sum up the introduction, I would really advise everyone who is interested in getting more detail about Elfie's and Dominik's history to check their LinkedIn profiles or their website. And we would probably run into a lot of details if we would describe all the things that you were doing in the past. But what is probably the most interesting thing, as I think so, is what you're doing right now. And that is that you do a lot of trainings. You have even published a book, Lösungsfokus. Pardon my German.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I say hi to Stefan Kreil right now, and I hope he's listening to us. And so you focus on the topic of leadership, which is very interesting topic, and you focus on it from the solution-focused perspective. And this is what we have talked about. That might be an interesting topic for our discussion today. So how do leaders interact if they would interact in a solution-focused way? So what do you think are the main points you would like to cover today?
I think when we talk about interactions, and especially leadership interactions, there is a kind of special picture that was developed about 50 years ago about how interactions or communication works. And what we're doing right now is, especially with microanalysis, seeing that interactions work quite differently. So I think it would be interesting to talk about interactions and how interactions work. And then from there on, what does solution-focused leader do? How do they, or could they interact? Because what we realize more and more is that it's wonderful to know about solution focus and to apply solution focus in leadership. And it makes a huge difference to also know more about microanalysis, or the insights of microanalysis that microanalysis gives us about interactions, about how do interactions work? What do we do there? How, when we ask a question, what happens? And when we have a formulation, for example, when we summarize things or comment things, how can we do that in a good way? And how can we also see that this is effective? And we can easily do that with microanalysis. And I think that's the two things for us really come together.
Yeah, I think microanalysis gives us a different language for what is really effective in conversations, particularly if we look at it from an interactional point of view. And this is one of the things we are really excited about, because with microanalysis, and we can learn so much about what we do in a conversation or in our interactions that is useful. And then we can use that and apply that for our leadership conversations, but also for any everyday interaction, actually.
So I heard the word interaction a couple of times. Seems like that is important to us today. And Dominik talked about a picture that was created 50 years ago, and that microanalysis somehow is giving us insight that the interactions work kind of differently. And today we would like to talk about how solution-focused leaders interact and how microanalysis gives us a couple insights that we can use, not even just for leadership conversations, but for everyday conversations.
Yeah, it's really true, and it's really interesting when you look back at the communication theories. You have this, you could say, one book, Pragmatics of Human Communication, came out in 1965, and it really shaped the way we talk about communication today. And over the last 50 or even more years, those ideas really kind of became mainstream ideas. And the interesting thing is, Janet Bavelas, who was co-author, the book was written by Paul Watzlawick, Janet Bavelas, and Don Jackson. She went on studying communication, and around, I don't know, 1990 to 2000, they came up with microanalysis and looked kind of what is really happening. And thus what we wrote there, you all know that you have 5 axioms of communication, like you cannot not communicate. Even if you don't know the book, that's kind of everyday language. Or the sender-receiver idea, that we send information and we receive information. And Janet Bavelas went on to study that, and they really discovered that communication is working differently.
Compared to a sender-receiver model.
Compared to the sender-receiver idea, yeah.
And usually in solution focus talks, we kind of avoid, the problem or what we want to get rid of. But since we are in a podcast, I'm still a little bit interested, because I think might be useful to understand the mainstream ideas that you were talking about. What do you think are the main ideas that somehow are, let's say, a little bit different than what Janet Bavelas and the team discovered?
I think that's a very useful question, even in solution focus, to address like differences and also problems sometimes, I think. And I think there are a lot of myths around communication that we can debunk with microanalysis of face-to-face dialogue. And So like, I think one idea is, if we look at the sender-receiver model, for instance, the idea is that I'm talking now with the two of you. And so everything I say is like I send it to you, and then you proceed it somehow, and then you give an answer to me, or you reply to me, you react to what I said. And what we can see with microanalysis of face-to-face dialogue, if we look at conversations millisecond per millisecond, is that we actually do so much more, and that you, while you're listening, Tomas, and I'm looking at you a lot right now,
Yes.
you're doing a lot of things that keep me talking. You're listening, you're displaying your listening by moving a bit more forward, opening your eyes, by nodding a little bit, by saying, by somehow giving me signs that you're listening. And the signs that you give me are very important for me to continue with what I'm saying. So we are basically co-creating the conversation in a face-to-face dialogue, moment by moment. And what I say is influenced by the reactions of the two of you. And that is very, very different to the idea that I say my full statement, and then you proceed it, and then you say your full statement. So we can really see that we co-create dialogue moment by moment. And there is a concept called calibration that shows that we around every 7 seconds, we calibrate what we say, which means we agree that we have enough understanding of what is said right now to proceed the dialogue. And every 7 seconds is really super, super fast. If you imagine, it's like, yeah, we're like really constantly agreeing, okay, we can move forward with the dialogue, or there is a misunderstanding, I'm not clear. And that's also something we display. We display by like looking, like putting our head a little back, or saying, huh, or like just with reactions we have.
And you can all try that if you don't if you want to experience that. It's really easy. If you have a conversation with someone, just ask a question and then don't move your eyes, don't move your head for just 5 seconds, and the other person will not be able to give the answer. The other person will start. But if you just open your eyes and don't blink, don't move your head, and it's really awkward. The other person will not go on and will say, is everything okay? Hello, did you hear me? So we need kind of in the conversation, we need to have this kind of constant calibration that we see, this display of listening that we see, and co-construct, co-create this dialogue together. And when you look at what that means, it's a huge difference.
It's please, Elfie.
I just wanted to add, like, there are so many ideas around active listening, that you have to summarize what the other person said and paraphrase, or whatever kind of ideas are around this active listening. And what we see with microanalysis is that listening is an active thing per se, because without nodding, without our displays with our reactions to constant reactions to what our conversation partner says, the conversation couldn't move on. And there is a very great study that Janet Bevelis and a few colleagues did. We call it the T-count study. So they invited people to share a close call story, something, where almost something horrible happened. And in a face-to-face dialogue. And the one group was listened, so they had two groups. And the one group, the storytellers told their stories, and the listeners were listening with their full attention. And the other group, the storytellers were listened to by the listeners, and they were counting all the T's they said in the conversation. And they recorded these conversations and then showed it to other people and asked them, who are the better storytellers? And well, it's maybe not so surprising that the better storytellers were those people who were listened to with full attention. So our listening makes a difference for the stories we hear. And as solution-focused practitioners, we know even more, because our listening does not only influence, it's not only the listening with the full attention, but it's also the listening for what is working already, the listening for what we want that makes a difference, because we display our listening at different times. We would react at different times. And I think that's very relevant for leadership as well, because like how often do we have we have a lot of leaders who share stories with us that I don't know, yeah, their employees come and then they wouldn't have a really good conversation or something, but they are often sitting at the computer and working, or still looking in their mobile phone, and or like, you know, with half attention, and that has a huge impact. So it's not only impolite, as we say sometimes, but it also has a huge impact at the quality of the conversation we have.
I think that's also the difference in, if you kind of look at our development, could say our journey, solution focus. About 5 years or 10 years ago, we would have said solution focused leadership is just leaders who focus on the preferred future, on what is working well, on small next steps or signs of progress. And we would have been happy if they just ask a nice question towards the preferred future. Maybe if you don't want that, what do you want instead? Or if kind of instead of looking at what is going wrong, looking at, okay, what is already working that goes towards where we want to go, we would have been really happy. But what happened with microanalysis now, when we do leadership trainings and also look at solution-focused leadership, we want leaders to become observers of their conversations. And when they do that, they see that not only kind of the questions they ask towards the preferred future, what is working well, signs of progress, small next steps, and all those solution-focused elements is important, but also, like Elfie said, the listening, the formulations, what do I pick up? We had, for example, in a leadership training a few months ago, we had a participant, and we let them record little conversations, 5-minute conversations. And the participant, the person talking about his issue, was talking about something kind of difficult for him, but he also had words like, you know, lately it's not working that well. And the word lately, for example, shows that it has been working better before. So when we looked at the tape, we saw that the person interviewing, kind of the leader, the coach, was only nodding at problem issues, like it's really difficult. Interesting. But if someone says lately, he did not react. And in the transcript, he didn't even have this word in there. So all those words who pointed towards a preferred future, to something that's working well, all those elements that we could pick up in a dialogue, he didn't pick up. And he did ask a nice question at the end of the kind of the story of the coachee, but while listening, he always encouraged with his nod, with he encouraged the other person to go on to tell the problem story. And that's for us a huge difference in how, not only how we teach, but also how we look at leadership.
And I was thinking about all the things you have said, and what came into my mind is that indeed I can confirm that there is much more than the sender-receiver model, because when I was summarizing a little bit what we would like to talk about today, you were nodding. That's when I noticed, well, they are nodding. Seems like I'm saying something that is okay. And the sender-receiver model seems to me that is too simplified, that the analysis they have done maybe left out a lot of important things. So it seems like communication is not like chess, because when I hear about the sender-receiver model, it seems like chess, that there's a turn of the opponent and then I make my turn and there's more or less nothing I can do until the other person finishes the turn. And what came into my mind is that you really want to focus the participants of your trainings to focus on small details in the interactions, so they become aware of what is happening, that there is more than the words, and for some of them somehow that there is more than a problem. And so what do you think a solution-focused leader does differently?
I would like
Yes,
to
yes.
challenge some of the things you said, or just to have an kind of an addition to that. Because when you say the sender-receiver model is simplified compared to calibration, that's for sure true, but it's also another paradigm. And that's for us the most important thing, because a sender-receiver model is a paradigm of two individuals who do things individualistically. So I do something and then send it over, and you do something. It's not about something we do together, but it's two individuals. It's a kind of a very individualistic view of communication compared to calibration, where we do everything together, constantly, second by second. It's for us a complete paradigm shift. And
yeah, that's true.
That's the fascinating thing for us.
I think that's like just what I would also like to highlight. So there is a shift from you do something and then I do something towards we co-create or co-construct meaning constantly. And then when we look at organizations, it's like what meaning do we co-construct as an organization, as a team, as a leader with my employees? What dialogue would I like to foster? What stories would I like to co-create or to curate with my team about our preferred future? So it's not about only, particularly when it comes to leadership, not only about having one conversation, but it's something that we constantly do and co-create, and where I hold like where we all together hold the space. It's a very abstract thing maybe, but where we invite each other to have conversations and interactions around what we want, around what's already working towards it, and really looking for also the assumption change is happening all the time reflects in this very beautifully, we think. Because if we co-construct constantly, it's also like we can go in all kind of directions. And where do we want to focus? We want to focus on the small little changes towards where we want to go. And those we want to amplify. And that's like, I mean, all of that, what we talk in solution focus somehow really comes together to what we do in calibration. That's like, for us, the really fascinating thing.
Yeah, and so solution-focused leadership goes, of course, the question that we always ask is, what do solution-focused leaders do? And they ask questions towards the preferred future, towards what works, towards signs of progress. They have formulations where they pick up the words that go in that direction. They listen for those things, but actually it's the wrong question, because it moves, kind of this paradigm shift moves the question to what are we doing together? So in a conversation, leader, employee, in a team meeting, in whatever you do in your everyday leadership practice, what do we do together and how do we do that? Because everybody's involved, the people who nod, who don't nod, who say yes, who don't say yes, who give an opinion, who don't give an opinion, who say something else, who go out of a meeting and say that was a stupid meeting, but didn't say something before. We're all constantly co-creating these conversations together. And this gives a totally different observation position for a leader. Because if you look at the conversation as a leader, if you have a conversation and you look at the conversation, if you have a videotape, for example, most of course don't tape their sessions, so they have to kind of think about what happened. But if you could look at the videotape of your sessions or your meetings, you would see how one thing kind of ties in with another thing, how when I say something, someone reacts, I react to the person, another person reacts, we go there. How conversations go, and as soon as you become observer of your own conversations, and with this idea of we do things together, you can then easily look at how can we have conversations that are fruitful, are solution focused, and it's much more than questions, much more than just kind of asking a good question.
And it's incredible what you can learn from just a 5-minute recorded conversation where you do like a helping conversation with someone else. And it doesn't even need to be your employee, but it's like there are things that you can learn like kind of from every conversation. And it's a difference to think about a conversation or to really tape the conversation and have a look at it.
And for all the listeners, if they want to go back and just listen at what happened in this dialogue already, you see how one thing influenced the other and how we're co-creating the story that we're telling here together.
Yep. When you were describing the sender-receiver model, that it's a completely different paradigm, it reminded me of Wittgenstein, which, well, that happens to you quite often when you make a decision that you want to do PhD on Wittgenstein. So maybe it would be completely irrelevant. So just make sure. But what Wittgenstein was more or less saying in his private language argument is that you cannot have a private language because language is something that is essentially public. So it's based on rules, and for rules to be obeyed or disobeyed, there has to be a room for error. And if there has to be a room for error, then there has to be more than one subject. So you cannot have just one person, because if you would have just one person cannot follow a rule privately, as Wittgenstein says, because following a rule and just having a feeling that you are following a rule would collapse into one. Basically, you could never tell if you just feel that you're doing things correctly or that it's really correctly what you do. And I was thinking recently, as I was a little bit writing that in my dissertation, is that if you can even have a problem as a one person, you know, because we sometimes like to think about ourselves as those, I think so, and I'm not sure where it comes from, doesn't really matter probably, maybe it's just myself, so make sure for yourself, but I sometimes feel that we like to think about ourselves as isolated individual islands, you know, and then I have this island, maybe that's the illusion of the private nature of my thinking, more or less, that what I think is not accessible to others. So I kind of have this island, and in this island, I create all these amazing thoughts, and then I use a language to tell it to others, right? That's how it feels. But I think it's completely different, because if you just think about it, you use language for thinking. Well, of course, you can think in pictures and in probably different ways, but more or less, if you're trying to reason, to think about, to reach some conclusions, then basically you need language, because it's just language that is in these relations that you can provide some reasons and make certain conclusions. You cannot have a picture and make a conclusion from a picture. That doesn't make sense, because you do not have such a relation between pictures. So you use language, and as the language is essentially from the society, then you cannot use anything else for reasoning, just the language. And the language comes from people. So you have to respect the rules of the language, and those rules are inherited in the language, and you inherit the language also. So you think in a language that is inherited. So basically, most of the things that you are able to think about are from the external world, and it's not your private invention, as it somehow feels. And I even came into a conclusion that I think to have a problem means to be in interactions where the problem exists in conversations, more or less. You have to be in interactions that are more or less the problem. So it's not like a private thing to have a problem.
We can 100% agree on that, yes. And it's also difficult if you look at the kind of your thoughts, you could say, as kind of your story you're telling yourself. It's almost impossible to tell yourself a story where no one else is involved. Your private problem is also not only based on language, but also in the story you have those kind of moments of where you are you could say codependent or in interaction with others, or not in interaction with others, or in a good or bad interaction, or whatever it is.
And at least somehow in a context.
The only addition I would probably make to your argument is also one thing that Wittgenstein said, and you didn't say that, but I think it's easy for people to not get that point, is that one thing is language, and the other thing is the meaning of you could say, of the words. And if we go with Wittgenstein and say the meaning of words, or of what we say, is in its use, and we translate that to leadership, then every team, every kind of every interaction we have, we look differently at what we do and what we say. We don't take a word as a word. We use that word in the use of the team, in the use of our interaction as a, let's say, leader and employee. And it's kind of, we have language, and we're bound to kind of rules of language, and still the meaning of what we say is that constantly co-created together, and it can be a completely different meaning, even if it's the same sentence in another team. And I think that's also very fascinating for looking at solution-focused interactions in leadership, because we cannot just go and say, well, the employee said that, so it's that. So we would need to kind of have an interaction about that. We would be invited to ask questions. So if you don't want that, what do you want instead? For example, it was not only a question of kind of a solution-focused focus, but it's also a question of meaning making, in the sense of finding our own use of those words that we're having in our team.
And I think people who are new who come new into an organization or into a new team, they know this, that you sometimes have to learn a few language words first. What is meant by, I don't know, that's maybe, there are people who don't know what a GDPR is, for instance, right? And that's a very, well, it's a term that's established, but it's not, you cannot assume that everyone knows what is meant by it. Or like, there are so many words that are used in organizations. And I know from sales trainings, for instance, that a lot of colleagues of ours who do sales training, they often would go there and say, be careful what you use. Then, well, if you have this team language here, that you don't use that with your clients, because that may sound a bit awkward. And so I think that's the one thing. And then there is even another thing to it that we notice quite often, and that's like that sometimes even we do not have the language that really would express what we are talking about, and particularly when it comes to an interactional view. Dominik and I, we often say, well, what's the right word? There is no word for it, because we are so used to look at other people and to come up with mentalistic explanations instead of just describing what's going on between us. And we have so much more words for describing what's going on in me or in you, and to, come up with whatever, compared to describing the interactions.
And also, interaction, you cannot describe interaction as something you do together. And if you look at what happens, you always describe it as one thing following the other. So it's very difficult to grasp what we really mean by we do interactions together, because we don't have the language for it. As soon as we start describing it in sequences, one thing after another. So it looks like a sender-receiver thing, or I do something, you do something. And we are curious what language we'll find the next years to describe really what's happening together while we're doing that.
And particularly when we looked at calibration and how Janet Bevelas, Jennifer Gerving, and Sarah Healing defined it. So it's a three-step process, but this three-step process can overlap. So step 1 can be step 2, and step 3, and step 2 can be step 1 and step 3. So it's like, and that's why communication works. So it's really reciprocal, and it's like just happening constantly. And that makes it so exciting, and it makes it so difficult because we do not really have the language. But what we notice is once people see it, it makes a difference to, particularly if they start to become curious about it as a leader. Then it's like something, it really changes the way how you look at your interactions, and there are no such things as failure, for instance, anymore.
I was thinking that we should somehow move from Wittgenstein, but it just caught my attention what Elfie said with the mentalistic explanations and mentalistic concepts. I have to come back a little bit to it because I just love it. To be honest, I do not like the topic of leadership that much, because when I hear people talk about the leadership, I sometimes find myself in a lot of pain. Maybe I have some masochistic tendencies, because I quite spent a lot of time on leadership and coaching managers and doing trainings to managers about leadership. But the pain that is caused by these concepts for me is that people view this leadership as some kind of a internal innate quality, and that's for me very disappointing, because they talk about leadership, they go to trainings, they are so interested in it, but their conclusion is that that's inner quality, and sometimes what is even more disappointing, that even this inner quality, it's not possible to describe it. It's mystery. It's inside of a person. You just have to be born with it. We have no hope to achieve that. Whereas I think that such a thing doesn't exist. At the end, if you have leadership inside, well, that's fine. But in the end, the leadership has to be demonstrated somehow. It has to show in the interactions, so it's about the interactions. And at the end, the inner leadership, the object that you have in your soul, or I'm not sure where do they locate it, it's out of the question, as Wittgenstein says in his beetle in the box. The beetle is not part of the language game at all. So that's what he says about the mental objects, that they cannot be part of the public language, because it doesn't really matter if they exist. So my message to all leaders is, well, it's probably not relevant if you have the inner leadership or not. What is relevant is if in the conversations, in the interactions, you demonstrate and you display the leadership. And if you do display, then you are a leader, and doesn't really matter if you have the leadership DNA or not. As Wittgenstein says, an inner process stands in need of outward criteria. So he asks us always, when we think about a word and its meaning, always ask yourself, how did we learn such a word? Well, I speak too much.
And that's now perfect for solution-focused leadership, because if you look at solution-focused leadership, it's all about interactions. It's all about how do we interact. And we define leadership as, and more leadership as everything a leader does in everyday interaction. It can be one-to-one coaching. It can be a meeting, but it's mostly a lot more. Just goes out and meets someone in the elevator, or closes the door and nods to someone, or just everything they do as leaders in their everyday leadership life. And of course that ties into everyday life, because they don't go out and are not doing that anymore. They go out and do that in the world. So for us, there's not much of a distinction. Kind of looking at leadership conversations, for example, looking at everyday life conversations is the same, because they're essentially the same just maybe in a little bit different context.
So maybe it's like not so much in a DNA, not so, I think not at all a DNA, but much more a discipline that you can, you know, train. And like, I mean, it's, again, we're trained for so many years to well, look at problems, to use like ideas from a different paradigm than postmodern ideas, maybe. And that's like thinking the earth is flat versus the earth is round. And and yeah, there was evidence back then that the earth is round, but still people didn't believe it. And I think it's like for a leader, what it's really so much about, when it comes to back to one thing, maybe it's really noticing and amplify useful change, and to bring all this useful change towards a preferred future into the conversation. And useful change are things we did in the past that worked. Useful change are all the things that we do that work towards a preferred future, and to bring them into the dialogue of the organization, into the dialogue with his employees, into the dialogue with himself or herself, and or themselves, and to really train, as a leader, train yourself to be able to do that, and then you will have different conversations.
And since we mentioned the word leader a lot, I was thinking that I should have asked this question a long time ago. Sometimes people think of leaders that this equals managers, you know, but probably it doesn't have to be just managers, but still I would assume that a big group of your participants of your training probably might be managers. And since manager and coach have a fundamental difference in the way that the coach doesn't care, or well, it's not what I wanted to say, but that the coach is neutral, you know, to put it in more formal words. Coach is not interested in the case of the client, and that's really important, and we can probably talk about for hours about that. And leader, or let's leave out the term leader, but manager is involved because they are codependent. If the employee fails, the manager fails. If the manager fails, the employee failed. So how do you, well, it's a leading question, of course, but how do you see this topic, you know, that the manager is not neutral, but uses the solution focus?
In 2012, we did the study about solution-focused leadership. We asked solution leaders who were trained in solution focus and back then were in leadership positions, mostly manager positions. What do they do? What works well? How do they apply solution focus? And what we got back were stories of everyday life interactions, like we said before. And what we distilled from there were differences between leadership and coaching. And one is exactly what you say, the difference between a leader who also has goals, who wants something, who is codependent, who is involved in what's going on, compared to a coach, an external coach, let's say this way. And it's interesting because we derived from their stories, we derived 4 different ways of how leaders kind of interact with employees who, if they want something, or also if they want something different. So that's really interesting from looking at those leadership conversations. If you want to answer from that standpoint, it's really cool to see how they engage employees in what they want, for example, how they support employees who want something different, but still set a frame of what they want and what the organization wants. And it's really, yeah, it would be probably a whole topic for a whole podcast.
And it's like we out of the answers, and also out of asking many more people, and also in our trainings, we developed a competency framework for solution-focused leaders. And one important point in there, and I think that's like also the main difference maybe between a coach and a leader, and you might find similarities there maybe too, but it's like really the setting a frame, and in a different way than a coach has to do. And that means sometimes being clear about the organizational rules, and you might have to fire someone if he doesn't, do things, but you can still, within this frame, you can still act solution focused. And one thing we love to do in our trainings is to ask people, by the end of the workshop, to think about where they now in their environment, in their organizations, in their work, see that solution focus is applicable 100%, where they feel it's like, maybe not, or I have to think a little bit more about that if it is, and areas where it's not, where it wouldn't work. And what's really interesting is when we do longer workshops, like we have a 7 days leadership course at the University of Applied Science. And when we start, we do it after it's 3 blocks. And after the first part, we usually do this, we call it kind of ample red light system, ample red light system. And so they would, for instance, put like firing someone cannot be done in a solution focused way. And then after 7 days, they they tell us stories. So we once literally had a student who was telling us, firing someone is impossible. And at the end, his success story, and they have to do a presentation at the end of the 7 days. So his presentation was about firing someone in a solution-focused way. And I think that's like a kind of a beautiful thing, that the lines are shifting, but there is always something about being clear about, what is the frame, and within that frame, we can do it like this, but there is also a moment where I have to say stop, and this doesn't work, and there I have to be clear. And I think that's a leader even more than a coach, that you sometimes have to, if I know something as a leader, and I wouldn't ask if I have the vision, and I don't want to, and it's clear already, then I wouldn't make a big meeting and inviting everyone to talk about the vision of the organization. But these are things that are happening quite often in organizations.
And you said the word clear and setting the frame. I think, that's super important. I think this is a very challenging and complex topic to do it properly, because I had really hundreds of conversations with managers talking about how to do solution focused and what is the benefit, because sometimes managers, they see solution focused, as a really interesting tool, and indeed that is an interesting tool and can be used for a lot of things, but sometimes they perceive the coach, as someone who knows how to talk to people, and they see value in it. But sometimes they have really goals that cannot be achieved by a coach. So they, for example, say, well, can you convince, those people, that, we should go to the right, but they want to go to the left. So you're the coach, they trust you. Could you just, maybe a little bit, questions, so they go to the right? And you always have to explain that this is not how coaching works, because one of the fundamental things is that we really follow the client in where the client wants to go. But on the other hand, I also have experience with having an interest in where the client wants to go, because what I do is I work as an agile coach / consultant. So sometimes I am hired to change the teams or change the unit or change the organization. And when you want to change the unit, change the team, you want to reach this goal, it would be difficult just by pure solution focused coaching. And you were in this conflict of interest. And what I've learned after some time is that the best thing you can do is to be always honest about what you think. And that doesn't really mean to start, telling to the person what they should do on Monday and how should they organize your work. But for example, to say, I work as an agile coach, and if you want, I can give you some perspectives on what agile methodology would suggest in this scenario, and then really in this frame, you can ask the solution focused questions. And I think the important key is to always being honest. What I think is the biggest challenge is when people go to solution focused training, they see, oh, those are interesting questions. Maybe if I change them a little bit, then I will reach the goal and I will, manipulate those people. So I think what is really not so good is when people try to manipulate with questions, that they ask leading questions to force the client into some conclusions. That is something I would not recommend.
Yeah. I think there is like just what you, like the stories you just shared, an example came to mind, like not from a coaching perspective, but from a trainer's perspective. We often have people in leadership trainings, they would ask us, okay, but how do I get my employee to dress up nicely? So that is a real example. I have an employee who doesn't really dress appropriate. So how do I get him to do that? And there we are as trainers also very clear. If you know that you need him to dress differently, tell him.
Yeah.
And then you can have a solution focused conversation with him about, you can and tell him how this is important for you, and tell him maybe what are the consequences if he doesn't, and then you can support him. With a solution-focused conversation, what would be helpful for him. But don't make a fuss around things where you're clear about. And I think that's one very important competence a solution-focused leader has. She knows, or he knows, when there is no room for negotiation, and when there are things that have to be told clearly, and she knows, or he knows, when there is a space where we can elaborate things.
It's very interesting because it always also ties in with our story of how kind of we worked, let's say 10 years ago, because back then we worked with the title coaching as leader, for example. And of course, when leaders come to a training that's called Coaching for Leaders, or if you call that approach a coaching approach, then they usually say, well, this was really interesting, but I'm not a coach, I'm a leader. And when we realized that around 2012 and started to change the name to Solution-Focused Leadership, to leadership interactions, and when you look at solution focus in this way, solution focus is a kind of, could say, a way to have conversations about what we want. And if I as leader want something, then it's also my obligation as solution focused leader to make that transparent, what I want, and then talk about what others want in this setting, in this frame, and hopefully to come up with a shared preferred future within this organizational frame that we have. But for us, it goes away kind of, we don't see solution focus as a coaching approach anymore. It's a therapy approach. Of course, it's a therapy approach, the coaching approach, but it's much more. It's an approach to have useful conversations together. And as soon as you're in a setting where everybody wants something, or also a team setting, well, everybody who wants something is invited to speak up, also the leader.
Yeah, and I would love to add that still in a moment where I'm very clear as a solution-focused leader, I'm not solution-focused in that way. So for us, this distinction between oh, this is not very solution focused, or like talking about this problem is not very solution focused. It's not this. It can be solution focused to talk about, you know, to have someone talk about the problem or to talk about a problem. But yet, as to come back to the beginning, as a solution focused leader, I would listen in a different way. I would, if we talk about the problem, I wouldn't listen for all the heaviness and for how did that happen and who is responsible and what's so horrible there. But I would rather listen for, maybe for Peter de Jong would say, what is important there for the person or for us. I would listen for everything that gives me signs that there was a difference for past successes. I would listen for what we want instead. And I wouldn't even highlight that at the very beginning. And that's also what, I mean, I think what a good therapist would do. They wouldn't just, you know, like move away as far, but sometimes you need to give this a little bit of space, particularly if it's important, as we talked earlier, for this, in this team, because they are used to do it this way. And then, but I still make a difference by the way how I, again, listen for and notice and amplify all the useful change. And with that, I make a difference.
What you just said remind me of a lot of things. One thing is, you know, that we are solution focused, not problem phobic. Not sure where did I steal it or from whom did I steal it from. I would really love to quote this, but I'm really not sure who said that. That's sad, but I'm really thankful for this quote. So hopefully it doesn't matter that much. And when we're talking about the problem, is Hazen Moon, she has this quadrant that you can talk about the problem in the past, you can talk about the problem in the future, solution in the past, solution in the future. So really what we're trying to achieve is not to force the client, you know, to talk about the future as fast as possible. Is much more complex. And that reminds me of what you said at the beginning, that really solution focus is not just about questions. We sometimes with the Stefan Kreil, we joke, you know, that what is the best solution focused question? You know, give me a list, you know, and a lot of people ask me, can you give me a list of solution focused questions that I would just read them? And it's much more complex. So it's not just about questions. And when you were saying about, when we were talking about the manager who wanted to make the employee to dress up a little bit. So I think it's not just about the questions, it's also about direct communication. It's one of the competencies that ICF has for coaches, to communicate directly. It's indeed very important. And I think the key, or at least that's my conclusion from what we were just discussing, is that if you do not want to manipulate people, and we kind of assume that you do not want to manipulate people, the key is, I think, partnering. And when I was preparing for my PCC, I think with Stefan, we spent almost half of our time during our mentoring discussing what partnering is, because it's very key. If you want to move from the ACC level to PCC, it's really the partnering is the crucial thing. So if you're going to partner with people, I think there's no problem. You know, you can directly communicate and say, you know, we're in a company that is strict, and the company says that you have to dress in this way, and I am your manager, and I somehow have to communicate this to you. And what do you think about that? What is your perspective on that? What you would like to do about that? How would you like to react on that? And if you're together, co-creating, co-constructing, as you were saying throughout our conversation, you're partners, and that's okay for me.
And I would like to add something, because when I learned solution focus, or when we all learned solution focus back in the days, kind of around 2003, around that, we learned questions. It was a question-based approach mostly. We learned questions, and they worked perfectly well, and we had great conversations just with a list of questions. And now we're making it a little bit more difficult and complicated, and all the fascination that we have and seeing. And it still works. If you have a list of solution-focused questions, ask them. They still work. It's still so easy. It's still so simple. And there's much more to it. But I would like to highlight, because I have the feeling that this just having questions is also something that it has such a great value, just of having a card set with questions, for example, and ask them in a meeting, ask a different question, see what happens. As a start, as a perfect start. And I want to see a solution-focused world where we also acknowledge that it can be so simple and it can be much more complicated and everything is okay. I don't like people who say, well, you know, it's not, you cannot just sell a list of questions and that's it. You can, and it works, and that's good, and you can do much more, that's good too.
Yeah, we know so many people who started with a list of solution-focused questions and started to ask it, and then they noticed something is different there, and sometimes it works, or like most of the time it works, sometimes it doesn't work, or this question doesn't work, and all of a sudden it works in another context. And but all those who make it explorable and enjoyable, they start to become curious and they want to learn more about it. And for the others, I think it was Ellen Quick who highlighted it, that beauty. I'm not sure if I'm quoting right, but in this conversation we had, she was saying, like, you know, it's better New Mexico, Albuquerque. Dvora Simon was that. I love that. She said, you know, so she was there for also from the very beginning of Solution Focus, and not the very, very beginning, but she met Steve and Inzu in New York very often. And she says, you know, she still celebrates every person who asks a different question, and she's a team leader as well. And she says, you know, everyone who asks a solution-focused question makes at least a difference for a moment in time. And I think this is such a lovely reminder also, particularly for us. We are super passionate and, you know, would like to see everyone, you know, using it because we're so convinced about it. And yet we see there are different circumstances, different worlds, and it's all right. And then go and ask a different question and make a difference in this moment. And
almost all of the people who trained us, or the people who train you have learned solution focus through questions. And Peter de Jong tells this cool story how he went to the first coaching sessions or therapy sessions in the beginning, and he was driving a car and he had this cassette tape of Insu, and he put it in, and then he kind of repeated her questions and then went into the therapy session and asked those questions. And I think that's still relevant and still good.
And I think with microanalysis, particularly with microanalysis, we got a new language and we got new ways of looking at conversations. I think that makes it even easier in trainings, for instance, to train people how to create their own questions out of a dialogue. And I think even more important, it goes away from I always have to ask the right question, because it's, if you hold like this focus, you will have a dialogue, and it might not be the perfectly framed solution focused question, but it's a question that goes in the direction of a preferred future, or of something that worked in the past, or of signs of progress and everything that's in between there.
It was a really lovely conversation today. I'm so grateful that we could have that. So as we're reaching the end of our time, so how would you like to conclude?
You did your PCC very well.
I would like to just say something about assumptions, because that's also something that's changed for us. And what do we assume about people? What do we assume about conversations, interactions, about the world? And if I had to, or we had to kind of break it down to kind of the least amount of assumptions, we probably say that everybody, and especially for leaders also, well, in everyday life too, but also now in this leadership conversation, as a leader, if you have two assumptions, one, that everyone is expert for his or her or their own life, and two, that change is happening all the time, and our job as leaders is to amplify useful change, then in our view, you have the two most relevant elements to have conversations that go in a solution-focused way.
And I would love to build on that and to say something that's really the one thing I and we see, or maybe that makes us so passionate about, or particularly, I don't know, us working with leaders, is that if you see the other people as experts for lives, for their lives, you can be in awe for all the experiences they have, and you can really use that on the one hand to achieve something better with the organization, and on the other hand you will make a difference for the people. And I always see, you know, if you engage with people in a solution focused way, you do not only amplify useful change towards the success of the company, but you also amplify joy, you amplify ease, you amplify collaboration, you amplify connection, you amplify possibilities, not only for the organization, but also for the people you're working with. And every time you do that, you make a difference for people. And the people, I know so many people, and also when I was working in organizations, I spent so much time leaving the organization, having a horrible boss, talking to my friends, my partner, and then my conversations were filled with rambling about how horrible work is. And I once had a boss and I didn't get my money in time, and and that was really affecting my life in a horrible way. So if you create a good environment for your employees and for yourself, I think it also we're allowed to do good things for ourselves as well, then you make a difference not only for the people who work with you, but also for their friends, for their families, and for their lives. And as solution-focused practitioners, this is one of the things I became very aware over the last years, particularly, is that, and Heather Fisk always says, every person who amplifies the reasons for living of another person is doing suicide prevention. And at the bottom line, we are doing that. Because when we connect with people, when we engage, when we can come into contact with something we're passionate about, that's something that also nourishes our reasons for living. And as a leader, we do that.
Thank you so much, and looking forward to the next interaction.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas.
Have you enjoyed today's show the same way I did? Then hit the subscribe!